First contact and the suspicion. The spaceship was silent, floating like a ghost in the endless void. The emergency lights flickered, casting long shadows along the metal corridors. Captain Xylara tightened her grip on her energy blade. Her squad moved carefully, their armored boots making soft thuds against the floor. The mission was simple: search the human vessel, gather information, and leave before anyone noticed. But now, standing inside the dark, ruined ship, Xylara felt uneasy. The air smelled of burnt metal and something strange, something she had never encountered before. One of her soldiers, Lieutenant Caven, scanned the area. His voice crackled through the communicator. "Captain, this place is unsettling. I see no bodies, but the damage suggests a battle." Xylara nodded. Humans were known for their brutality. They were dangerous, unpredictable creatures. The stories told by her people warned of their cunning nature, their ability to survive against impossible odds. Then she saw it. A figure lay motionless against the wall, half covered in debris. A human. Her heart pounded. She raised a fist, signaling her squad to halt. They surrounded the body, weapons ready. The human wore a torn spacesuit, his face partially hidden by a cracked visor. Blood dried on his forehead, but his chest moved. He was alive. Xylara's sharp eyes scanned him, searching for hidden weapons. Then she spotted something strange. A bulge. It was visible even through the fabric of his suit, resting near his waist. Her instincts screamed danger. Humans were known for their concealed weapons, for using deception to their advantage. Could this be one of their tricks? A secret tool of destruction? She stepped forward, her energy blade humming to life. "Wake him," she ordered. Kevin hesitated but obeyed, reaching down and shaking the human's shoulder. The response was immediate. The human groaned, his face twisting in pain. His eyes fluttered open, revealing bright blue irises. He blinked several times, confused, before locking eyes with Xylara. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the human sat up quickly, his movements slow but defensive. Xylara reacted on instinct, raising her blade to his throat. "Do not move." The human froze, his hands half raised. He looked at the sharp edge of the blade, then at Xylara's face. His mouth opened, but the only sound that came out was garbled noise. His translator was broken. Xylara frowned. She pointed her weapon at the suspicious bulge on his body. "What is this? A weapon? A bomb?" The human followed her gaze, looking down at himself. Confusion spread across his face. He muttered something under his breath, rubbing his forehead as if trying to understand the situation. Coven took a step closer. "Captain, should we secure him?" Before Xylara could respond, the human slowly lifted his hands in a peaceful gesture. He tried speaking again, but the words were meaningless. Xylara's grip on her blade tightened. The human was stalling. He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She had to act fast. Just as she prepared to disarm him, the ship shook violently. An alarm blared through the halls. The lights flashed red. One of her soldiers checked his scanner. His voice was full of panic. "Captain, another ship is approaching. We've been detected." Xylara cursed. This mission was supposed to be a stealth operation. If humans were coming, they had little time. She turned back to the human, who now looked just as alarmed as her squad. He reached toward his wrist, pressing a button on his broken communicator. A crackling voice came through, distorted but urgent. Xylara didn't need a translator to understand what it meant. Reinforcements were coming. Her squad looked at her, waiting for orders. They could not afford to be caught, but they could also not leave the human behind. He could be valuable. The human, seeing their hesitation, slowly pointed at his own chest. Then he pointed at Xylara's ship, making a simple gesture. "Take me." Xylara narrowed her eyes. Was this a trick? A way to infiltrate their forces? The alarms grew louder. She had no choice. With a sharp nod, she signaled her squad. "Secure him." "We're leaving." Coven hesitated. "But Captain, what about?" "Now," she snapped. Two soldiers grabbed the human, pulling him to his feet. He did not resist, though his face showed uncertainty. Xylura's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, her mind racing. The mission was compromised. The humans were coming, and she had just brought one of their own onto her ship. She had no idea if it was the biggest mistake of her life, or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Misunderstanding and panic. The metal walls of the spaceship hummed with tension. The air was thick with uncertainty as Xylura's squad dragged the human onto their vessel. His movements were sluggish, his body still weak from whatever had happened on his ship. Yet his eyes were sharp, scanning everything. Xylura walked ahead, leading her team through the docking bay. The human was surprisingly silent, his gaze flicking between the towering alien warriors surrounding him. He must have known he was at their mercy. Still, Xylura didn't trust him. Humans were cunning, deceptive. She glanced at the strange bulge beneath his torn suit. Her instincts screamed danger. It could be a hidden weapon, a biological explosive, some kind of tracking device. "Restrain him," she ordered. Coven hesitated. "Captain, he's weak. He can barely stand." Xylura's tone was cold. "Weakness means nothing. Humans adapt. They wait for the right moment to strike." Coven gave a stiff nod and reached for the human's arms, but the moment his hands touched him, the human flinched. A reflexive movement, but quick, too quick. Xylura's blade was in her hand in an instant, aimed directly at his throat. "Do not move." The human froze. His blue eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Xylura noticed something odd. There was no fear in them. He wasn't panicking like a trapped animal. He wasn't resisting. He was just staring. For a second, an uneasy silence stretched between them. Then the human spoke. His voice was deep, but the words were garbled, distorted. His translator was still broken. Xylura clenched her jaw. "Fix his translator. I want to hear what this creature has to say." One of the technicians, a young warrior named Tovak, stepped forward, scanning the human's damaged equipment. "It's badly damaged, Captain. I can try to override it, but it might take time." "We don't have time," Xylura snapped. The human seemed to understand. He raised his hand slowly, a universal sign of surrender, then motioned toward his waist. Xylura tensed. The bulge. Coven immediately raised his weapon. "Captain, he's reaching for something." "Hold," Xylura ordered, her grip tightening on her blade. The human, moving deliberately slow, tugged at his suit and pointed at the bulge. Then he shook his head, gesturing between himself and Xylura, as if trying to explain something. Xylura narrowed her eyes. "What are you trying to say, human?" He sighed. Then, in a single motion, he unzipped part of his suit. Coven gasped. Tovak took a sharp step back. Xylura's entire body locked up. The room fell into absolute silence. Every warrior stood still, their eyes locked on the thing that had been hidden beneath the human suit. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an explosive. It was part of him. For the first time in her life, Xylura had no idea what to do. The human looked at their stunned expressions, and for the first time, he smiled. A small, amused smirk that only infuriated Xylura more. "You." She took a sharp breath, struggling to process what she was seeing. "You were hiding this." The human didn't respond, but his smirk grew slightly wider, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. Xylura's face burned with frustration. This human, this creature, had just embarrassed her in front of her entire squad. She had assumed it was a weapon, had been ready to kill him over it. And now she wished she had. Coven coughed awkwardly. "Captain, should we secure it?" Xylura glared at him. Tovak, still wide-eyed, whispered under his breath, "Humans are terrifying." The human tilted his head, as if curious. He had no idea what kind of impact this revelation had on them. Zylera took a deep breath, forcing her composure back. Enough. She turned to her warriors. Say nothing of this. This thing does not concern us. Coven nodded quickly. The rest of the squad pretended to look elsewhere. But Zylera knew. She had lost control of the situation. This human, this Jake Carter, had just humiliated her. And worse, he knew it. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Zylera would make sure of that. The great escape. The silence was unbearable. Zylera sat in the command chamber, fingers clenched against the metal table. The human, Captain Jake Carter, was in the secured holding cell, but he was not bound. Her warriors had refused to shackle him after the incident. Her warriors, hardened soldiers, fearless fighters. Yet, ever since the revelation, they had avoided the human with a strange mix of respect, horror, and awkward curiosity. Tovak had muttered, "We underestimated them." Coven had simply shaken his head and refused to speak about it. And Zylera, she was furious. Her pride had taken a hit, and worse, the human had enjoyed it. She had seen it in his infuriating smirk. The way he looked at her, mocking without saying a word. She exhaled sharply, standing up. She needed to regain control. But just as she turned toward the control panel, the alarms blared. "Captain, we have incoming," a soldier shouted from the bridge. "A Xendarian warship is approaching fast." Zylera's blood ran cold. Xendarians. They were neither human nor part of her own kind. They were pirates, conquerors, slavers, and they never left survivors. She strode into the bridge, her warriors already at their stations. Shields up. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. The screen flickered, and a holographic transmission appeared. A grotesque creature, its face covered in jagged scars, sneered at her. "Commander Vrak of the Xendarian fleet." "Ah, Captain Zylera," the alien rasped, his voice dripping with malice. "I see you found a human." His slitted eyes glowed with greed. "Hand him over, and I might let you live." Zylera's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. "You think I will surrender to filth like you?" Vrak laughed. "You misunderstand, Captain. That human is valuable. To us. To the highest bidder. Give him up, or we'll tear your ship apart and take him ourselves." A tense silence followed. Zylera's mind raced. Her ship was fast, but outgunned. If she engaged in a fight, that wouldn't last long. She needed options, and she needed them now. "Captain," a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned sharply. Jake Carter stood at the entrance of the bridge, arms crossed, watching the screen. She had forgotten to lock the cell. The human's blue eyes studied the enemy commander, his expression unreadable. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Vrak narrowed his eyes. "Why are you grinning, human?" Jake stepped forward, standing beside Zylera. "Because," he said, stretching his arms lazily, "you've already lost." The bridge fell silent. Zylera whipped her head toward him. "What are you doing?" she hissed. Jake didn't answer. His gaze remained locked on Vrak. "You see," Jake continued, his voice calm but laced with something dangerous. "You think you're in control. That we're scared. But the thing about humans." He leaned forward slightly, his smile turning into something sharp. "We don't do well with threats." Vrak's sneer faltered. Jake turned to Zylera. "Can you open a frequency to my people?" She hesitated. This was her ship, her command, but something about Jake's demeanor, something about the confidence in his voice. She signaled the comms officer. A static-filled signal crackled through the air. Jake pressed a button on his wrist communicator. His translator, now somewhat functional, beeped as he spoke. "This is Captain Carter to UEC Fleet. If you're picking this up, you might want to bring some fireworks. We've got company." The moment he finished speaking, the Xendarian commander's sneer twisted into rage. You called for reinforcements. Vrock roared. You're bluffing. Jake's grin widened. Try me. A split second later, the radar lit up. Multiple human warships had just entered the system, and they were headed straight for them. The Exendarian attack. Vrock's warship opened fire before Zilura's crew could react. The entire vessel shook violently, sparks flying as shields absorbed the first barrage. Return fire, Zilura barked. Plasma cannons roared, but the Exendarians were relentless. Jake gripped the back of Zilura's chair to keep from falling. I don't think they're gonna wait for my guys to show up. No, they won't, Zilura growled. She turned to her pilots. Prepare for an emergency warp jump. Kavan's eyes widened. Captain, that's risky. Do it. The engines hummed dangerously. The ship was already damaged, and a warp jump in this condition could rip them apart. But staying meant certain death. Zilura turned to Jake. If we die, I will personally haunt you in the afterlife. Jake smirked. That's fair. The ship lurched violently as the engines roared. The Exendarian vessel fired again, but just before the shots landed. They jumped. Crash landing. The warp jump lasted only seconds. Then, boom. The ship exploded out of warp, tumbling through a planet's atmosphere. Alarms screamed. Fires erupted. The planet below grew closer by the second. Jake cursed, gripping the edge of the console. Tell me this was part of the plan. It was, Zilura gritted out. Just not the landing part. The ground rushed toward them. Then, impact. Metal screeched. Smoke filled the air. The ship crashed into dense alien terrain, breaking through trees and skidding across the ground before finally coming to a stop. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Zilura coughed, pushing debris off herself. We're alive, she muttered. Barely. Jake groaned nearby. I'm going to feel that tomorrow. Coven stumbled in. Captain, we have a problem. Zilura sighed. Of course we do. What now? Coven swallowed. The Exendarians followed us. Jake wiped blood from his forehead. Oh, fantastic. Let's add being hunted to the list of today's problems. Zilura grabbed her weapon. They had escaped the Exendarians once. Now, on an unknown planet, they had to do it again. But this time, they were completely on their own, forced to work together. The smoke was thick. The air reeked of burning metal and scorched earth. Zilura staggered to her feet, brushing off the dust and debris that clung to her armor. Her ship, her pride, her home, her command, was now a broken wreck on an unknown planet. She took a slow breath, eyes scanning the destruction. Trees had been flattened by the ship's impact, and pieces of the hull lay scattered across the ground. The night sky above was dark, filled with swirling alien clouds, and in the distance, glowing eyes watched from the shadows. But none of that mattered right now, because the Exendarians had survived the crash too. Kevin stumbled to her side, one hand pressed to his wounded shoulder. Captain, scanners are down, but I saw their ship break apart before impact. Are they alive? Zilura asked, her voice cold. Kevin hesitated. Some, yes, and they'll be coming. Zilura cursed under her breath. She turned sharply toward the human, Jake Carter. He was sitting on a broken piece of metal, holding his side. His suit was torn, blood smeared across his face, but he looked annoyingly calm. Zilura narrowed her eyes. You brought this on us, human. Jake scoffed. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I pilot your ship into a planet? He gestured at the wreckage. I think that was you. She clenched her fists. I should have left you on your ship. Jake stood up, wincing slightly. Yeah, well, you didn't. And now we have a bigger problem. Coven nodded grimly. He's right. The Exendarians won't stop until they hunt us down. Zilura exhaled sharply. She knew the truth. This was no longer just about survival. It was war. And as much as she hated to admit it, They needed the human to survive. The first night, survival and distrust. The group moved deeper into the jungle. The terrain was rough, the plants unfamiliar. Some glowed softly, others pulsed with an eerie light. Strange sounds echoed in the distance. Growls, clicking noises, the rustling of unseen creatures. Xylura's warriors stayed close, their weapons drawn. But Jake, he was walking slightly ahead, scanning the environment, completely at ease. Xylura narrowed her eyes. "You seem comfortable." Jake smirked. "I grew up in places like this. You grew up in a hostile jungle." "Earth has a few," he said casually. "This isn't too different. Stay away from anything glowing. Don't touch the weird plants, and whatever is watching us." He pointed to the trees. "If it hasn't attacked yet, it's either hunting us or afraid of something bigger." Coven looked at him with concern. "Something bigger?" Jake didn't answer. They reached a clearing and decided to make camp. Fires were too dangerous. *** light would attract predators. ***, so they settled for a defensive circle. The warriors sat in silence, weapons in their hands. The air was heavy with tension. Jake leaned against a tree, stretching his arms behind his head. "So what's the plan, fearless leader?" Xylura shot him a glare. "We rest. At dawn, we move." Jake arched an eyebrow. "You're assuming the Tendarians will wait until morning." Silence. Xylura hated that he was right. She sighed. "Fine. We'll set up a perimeter. If they come, we'll be ready." Jake grinned. "See, now you're thinking like a human." She scowled. "Do not compare me to you." Jake just chuckled, settling in. "Suit yourself, Captain." The attack. It happened fast. A shriek tore through the jungle. Warriors jumped to their feet, weapons hummed to life. Something moved in the trees. Xylura's eyes darted through the darkness. "Everyone." Then the first Tendarian struck. A massive lizard-like warrior burst from the shadows, slashing at the nearest soldier. A scream. Blood splattered across the ground. Ambush. The clearing exploded into chaos. Xylura moved fast, slashing through one of the attackers. More came. The Tendarians had been hunting them, waiting for the perfect moment. Now they were here. Jake was already fighting. Xylura barely had time to process it, but he wasn't using a gun. He fought with his hands. A Tendarian lunged. Jake dodged, twisting his body, slamming his elbow into the creature's throat. Another one grabbed him, but he turned, using its own momentum to flip it over. Xylura's eyes widened. Humans were supposed to rely on their weapons, but Jake fought like a predator. Fast, brutal, precise. A warrior screamed behind her. She turned, too slow. The Tendarian's blade came down, and Jake caught it with his bare hands. Xylura's heart stopped. The human grunted, blood dripping from his palm, then twisted the blade away and drove his fist into the enemy's skull. The Tendarian collapsed. Silence. The remaining enemies hesitated, their confidence shaken. Then, just as quickly as they came, they fled. The jungle returned to silence, only the sound of ragged breathing filling the air. Xylura turned to Jake. He was panting, his hands bloody, but his eyes were alive with adrenaline. Coven whispered, "Spirits help us. Humans are monsters." Xylura looked at Jake differently now. She had underestimated him. She wouldn't make that mistake again. The agreement. An hour later, after tending to the wounded, Xylura approached Jake. He sat on a rock, wrapping his injured hand. He didn't look up when she spoke. "You fight well," she admitted. He smirked. "I try." She exhaled slowly. "If we're going to survive this, we need to work together." Jake's expression softened. "Now you're making sense." She held out her hand. A warrior's handshake. Jake looked at it. Then, with a smirk, he shook it. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was trust. For the first time, Xylera wasn't just tolerating a human. She was fighting beside one. And that terrified her more than anything else. The truth about humans. The jungle was quiet again, but not peaceful. Xylera crouched near the bodies of the fallen Xandarians, scanning the treetops for movement. No sign of another attack. The enemy had fled. For now. Her warriors moved cautiously, checking injuries, whispering among themselves. But she noticed something strange. They kept glancing at Jake. Not with hostility. Not even with curiosity. With fear. She understood why. She had watched him fight with his bare hands, watched him break warriors twice his size, watched him smile in the middle of battle. Jake Carter wasn't just a soldier. He was a predator. And now Xylera had to decide if that made him an ally or the most dangerous creature in the jungle. The escape plan. The group moved at dawn. The Xandarians wouldn't stay away forever. And worse, their distress signal was still out there. More enemy ships could arrive at any moment. Xylera pulled up a damaged holomap from her wrist device. The wreckage of our ship is about 3 kilometers east. We salvage what we can and keep moving. Jake nodded. And then, we find a way off this planet. Jake rubbed his jaw. That's the problem. My fleet is tracking my last location. If we stay in one place too long, the Xandarians will find us first. Kevin crossed his arms. Then we fight. Jake sighed. Yeah, because that worked out so well last night. Kevin's nostrils flared, but Xylera stepped between them. We need a real plan. Jake pointed at the sky. You have one. She frowned. Explain. Jake smirked. That Xandarian ship didn't just crash. It still has a working beacon. Xylera's eyes widened. You want to hijack it? Jake shrugged. I don't like walking. Her warriors exchanged glances. Stealing an enemy ship. A suicidal mission. But Xylera found herself grinning. It was reckless. It was impossible. It was exactly what a human would do. The tension grows. As they moved toward the Xandarian wreck, the jungle grew denser, the shadows darker, the air heavier. Jake walked beside Xylera, his eyes scanning the trees. He was unnaturally calm. She finally asked what had been on her mind. You don't fear this place. Jake raised an eyebrow. Why would I? You don't fear the Xandarians. He smirked. Not really. She hesitated. Do you fear anything? He was silent for a long moment. Then he answered. Losing. She expected arrogance. Instead, his voice was cold. Flat. Real. Xylera studied him in a new light. Humans were not fearless. They just didn't let fear control them. And that made them terrifying. The Xandarian ship. By midday, they reached the crash site. The Xandarian ship was half buried in the ground, its hull cracked but intact. Smoke still drifted from the engines. Jake whistled. She's ugly, but she'll fly. Xylera motioned for silence. Xandarians don't leave their ships unguarded. She was right. A group of Xandarian survivors had set up a perimeter, guarding the wreck. They had weapons, but their numbers were thinned. It was now or never. Jake crouched beside Xylera. All right, Captain. How do you want to do this? Xylera considered. A direct assault was risky, but an infiltration. Jake grinned, as if reading her mind. I have an idea. Her stomach dropped. She already knew it would be insane. The plan. Jake's idea was simple. Too simple. Step 1. Cause a distraction. Step 2. Steal the ship while the Xandarians were busy. Step 3. Don't die. Xylera hated it. Do humans always make plans based on wishful thinking? She muttered. Jake grinned. Pretty much. The attack. Kelvin threw a plasma grenade into the jungle. The explosion sent fire and smoke into the air. The Xandarians rushed toward the blast. And that's when Jake moved. He sprinted through the wreckage like a shadow, sliding past debris, ducking under broken beams. Xylera followed, her warriors close behind. Inside the ship, red emergency lights flickered. The air was hot, metallic. Xylera silently took out a guard with her blade. Jake grabbed another from behind, slamming his head into a control panel. They reached the cockpit. Jake grinned, cracking his fingers. Time to fly. Xylera hesitated. You know how to pilot this thing. Jake pressed random buttons. The ship rumbled. Systems activated. He grinned. Nope, but I can learn fast. The chase. As the engines roared to life, the Xendarians realized what was happening. They're stealing our ship. Gunfire ripped through the hull. Jake yanked the controls. Hold on to something. The ship lurched upward, shaking violently. Outside, the remaining Xendarians scrambled to stop them. One of them jumped onto the hull. Xylera growled. We have company. Jake swore. Can you deal with that? Xylera grabbed her blade. With pleasure. Final fight on the ship. The Xendarian clawed his way toward the cockpit. Xylera climbed through a side hatch, balancing on the unstable metal. The wind howled. The ground was far below. The Xendarian lunged. Xylera dodged, slashing her blade across his chest. He roared, grabbing her arm. She lost balance, almost slipped off the edge. Jake saw it. His eyes flashed. He let go of the controls. What are you doing? Xylera shouted. Jake ran toward the hatch, grabbed her collar, and yanked her inside just as the Xendarian fell. Xylera landed hard, breathing heavily. She looked up at him. You're insane, she muttered. Jake grinned. You're welcome. Freedom. For now. The ship broke through the clouds, escaping the atmosphere. The stars stretched out before them. Jake leaned back in the pilot's seat, exhaling. That was fun. Xylera glared at him. Never do that again. Jake smirked. No promises. Coven sighed. Spirits help us. Xylera couldn't believe it. They had actually survived. But she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. Because now, she wasn't just escaping with a human. She was starting to respect him. And that was even more dangerous than the Xendarians. A new understanding. The stolen Xendarian ship hummed through the void of space, its patched-up systems barely holding together. Red warning lights flashed across the control panel, and every few minutes, the ship groaned like a dying beast. Jake Carter leaned back in the pilot's seat, stretching his arms. She's holding together. For now. Xylera stood behind him, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the readings. Barely. Jake grinned. That's still better than not holding together. Kevin, still adjusting to the humans' reckless optimism, grumbled, we wouldn't be in this situation if humans weren't so chaotic. Jake glanced over his shoulder. Oh, come on, you love it. Kevin did not respond. The tension in the room had changed. No longer just hostility or fear. Something different was growing. Uneasy respect. And that unsettled Xylera more than anything. Contacting the human fleet, Xylera exhaled. We need to send a message. If your fleet is tracking your signal, they should be nearby. Jake nodded, flipping switches on the control panel. Signal's weak, but I can boost it. Give me a sec. Tovak muttered, if they even care enough to respond. Jake's hands froze. Xylera narrowed her eyes. Why wouldn't they? Jake didn't answer immediately. He hesitated, as if debating whether or not to tell them. Finally, he sighed. Let's just say, I wasn't exactly on a mission. Coven frowned. Then why were you alone on that ship? Jake smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Long story. Short version. I pissed off the wrong people. Xylera's suspicion deepened. Your own kind. Jake exhaled. Yeah. A flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Humans valued their own. They never abandoned their own in battle. But if Jake had been left behind on purpose, before she could ask, the comm system crackled to life. A deep, commanding voice echoed through the bridge. "This is Admiral Ross of the UEC fleet. Identify yourself." Jake leaned forward, voice steady. "Admiral, it's Carter." A long pause. Then, "Carter." Zylera sensed something in the man's voice. Not relief, not excitement. Something else. Admiral Ross continued, his tone careful. "Carter, this is unexpected." Jake's jaw tightened. "Yeah, well, it's been a hell of a week." Requesting immediate retrieval. More silence. Then, "Understood. Transmitting coordinates." The message ended. Coven crossed his arms. "They don't sound very eager to welcome you back." Jake sighed. "Yeah, I noticed." Zylera filed that away for later. Because right now, they had bigger problems. A dangerous truth. Hours passed as they drifted toward the rendezvous point. The silence was suffocating. Jake stood alone in the cargo bay, staring out into space. Zylera found herself watching him. For the first time, he seemed tired. She stepped forward. "What did you do?" Jake glanced at her, then back at the stars. "I did what I thought was right." "That's not an answer." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "I exposed something my superiors didn't want exposed. A mission gone wrong. People died. Good people." He exhaled. "And instead of fixing it, they covered it up." Zylera frowned. "So, they abandoned you." Jake's smirk returned, but it was hollow. More like, "They sent me on a mission they knew I wouldn't return from." Her stomach twisted. Betrayal. She knew the taste well. For the first time, she felt something strange for this human. Not just respect. Not just curiosity. Understanding. "We are not so different," she admitted. Jake glanced at her, surprised. "Yeah." She nodded. "My people do not abandon their own. Not unless they fear them." Jake laughed, but it was humorless. "Well, that makes two of us." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she left. The human fleet arrives. When the UEC fleet finally appeared, it was a wall of steel and firepower. Zylera's warriors stiffened at the sight of the massive human warships. Even Jake's face darkened slightly. "Guess this is it," he muttered. The main docking bay opened, pulling them in. The second their ship landed, human soldiers surrounded them. Weapons raised. Zylera growled. "This is how you welcome your own." A man in a high-ranking uniform stepped forward. Admiral Ross. His sharp eyes locked onto Jake. "Carter," he said, his voice emotionless. Jake stepped off the ship, raising his hand slightly. "Admiral." Hell of a greeting. Ross didn't react. He simply gestured. "Come with me." Jake turned to Zylera. A silent conversation passed between them. "I don't trust them." "Neither do I." But there was no choice. Zylera clenched her jaw. She wasn't done with this human. And she wasn't about to let him walk into danger alone. So when Ross turned, leading Jake away, Zylera followed. And she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The final stand, and a new beginning. The halls of the UEC flagship were cold, metallic, and sterile. Nothing about them felt welcoming. Zylera walked beside Jake, surrounded by human soldiers. Their weapons were holstered, but their hands hovered near them. The silent warning. Jake smirked at one of them. "Relax, boys. I'm not gonna bite." The soldier didn't smile. Zylera observed everything, noting the tension in Jake's jaw. His body was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. This wasn't a rescue. This was an interrogation. And she wasn't about to let her only ally face it alone. The Admiral's ultimatum. Admiral Ross led them into a dimly lit war room. A massive screen displayed tactical data, ship movements, and classified reports. Ross gestured for Jake to sit. He didn't. Zylera remained standing beside him, arms crossed. She could sense it, the power struggle happening between these two men. Finally, Ross spoke. You should be dead. Jake smirked. Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises. Ross didn't react. His eyes flicked toward Xylara. And you brought an alien aboard a classified military vessel. Xylara met his gaze without flinching. Your man would be dead without me. Ross studied her for a moment. Then he turned back to Jake. Carter, you're a problem. Jake exhaled. Yeah, I get that a lot. Ross tapped the screen. It showed the wreckage of the Tendarian ship, the battle logs, the unauthorized distress signal Jake had sent. You disobeyed orders, Ross continued. You exposed your position. You endangered this fleet. Jake rolled his eyes. Oh, please. If I hadn't stolen that ship, the Xendarians would have gotten here first. You should be thanking me. Ross leaned forward. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. I don't reward traitors. Silence. Xylara's grip on her weapon tightened. Jake's smirk faded. Ross exhaled. I have two choices. Court-martial you for insubordination. He glanced at Xylara. Or use this situation to our advantage. Xylara's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Ross tapped the screen again. A fleet of Xendarian warships appeared. Xylara's blood ran cold. Jake stiffened. Ross continued. They're regrouping, preparing for a full-scale attack. And now, thanks to you two. He looked at Xylara. We have an opportunity. She folded her arms. What kind of opportunity? Ross leaned back. An inside agent. Jake laughed. Oh, hell no. Ross ignored him. The Xendarians won't trust humans, but they might trust an alien they've fought before. His eyes locked onto Xylara. Jake stepped forward, furious. You want to use her as bait. Ross didn't blink. I want to win. Silence stretched between them. Then Xylara did something unexpected. She laughed. Ross raised an eyebrow. Something funny. Xylara smirked. Humans and Xendarians are not so different after all. Ross tilted his head. How so? She leaned forward, voice sharp as a blade. You both underestimate me. Ross's eyes darkened. But Xylara wasn't done. You think I'm just another soldier to be used, a pawn. But I've faced Xendarians before. I know their strategies, their weaknesses. If you want a war. She stepped even closer, eye to eye with Ross. Then let me fight it my way. Ross studied her. Jake grinned. You really don't know how to back down, do you? Xylara smirked. You like that about me? Jake chuckled. A little. Ross exhaled. Fine. We do it your way. But if you fail. Jake interrupted. We won't. Ross's expression was unreadable. Then he turned, issuing orders to his officers. Jake leaned toward Xylara. That was impressive. She arched an eyebrow. I learned from the best. The final battle. The plan was simple. Lure the Xendarians into an ambush. Take out their command ship before reinforcements arrived. Survive. Xylara's squad was deployed first. Jake went with them, much to Ross's irritation. As they approached the enemy fleet, Xylara felt it. The calm before war. Jake nudged her. You nervous? She scoffed. I was about to ask you the same. He grinned. Good. That means we're both lying. The ships broke through the enemy's outer defenses. Alarms blared. Xendarian fighters swarmed, their energy cannons lighting up the battlefield. The UEC fleet opened fire. Space exploded into chaos. Xylara led her warriors through the carnage, boarding the Xendarian flagship. The corridors were filled with enemy soldiers. The fight was brutal, hand-to-hand combat mixed with plasma fire. Jake fought beside her, back to back. Every time she slashed with her blade, he fired a precise shot, a perfect rhythm. Xylara growled as she cut through another enemy. I'm beginning to think I was wrong about you. Jake shot an attacker behind her. You're just now figuring that out. She smirked. Damn humans. Victory and consequences. The battle was long, But in the end, they won. The Exendarian flagship was destroyed. Their fleet scattered. On the UEC command deck, Admiral Ross observed the wreckage through the viewing screen. It's over. Jake sat on a crate, exhausted. Told you we wouldn't fail. Ross turned to him. You're still a liability. Jake sighed. And you're still an asshole. Xylera stiffened, expecting punishment. But instead, Ross smirked. Fine. Then let's make it official. He tossed Jake a military insignia. Jake caught it, staring at it. What is this? Ross folded his arms. You're reinstated. And you. He glanced at Xylera. You have my respect. Xylera was stunned. Jake blinked. Wait. That's it. No dramatic speech. Ross sighed. Get off my ship, Carter. Jake grinned at Xylera. Guess that means we're free. She nodded. For now. Jake smirked. You sticking around? Xylera looked at the stars. Then at him. She grinned. Try and get rid of me. Jake laughed. And just like that, their real adventure began.